What's up and welcome everyone to a new video here on the official MTG Arena YouTube channel. My name is Ashlizzle, and for those not familiar, I'm a Magic the Gathering content creator known for building fun and competitive decks in Standard. And today we'll be having a look at the new cards from Murders at Card of Manor and how they could impact the Standard format. Now I'll be going over the best 5 cards in each color that I think will see the most play and what decks you could play them in. We'll then also briefly talk about the lands. And definitely let me know in the comments what your favorite cards are from Murders at Card of Manor, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Now before we get started, I just want to clarify that there is a good chance that I am wrong about some of these cards. I mean, it's very difficult to predict how a card will perform without having ever played with the card or in that meta. Now, I don't think there's ever a Magic player that's 100% right when it comes to these set reviews. For instance, like a great example that comes to mind is during the Kamigawa era, the majority of the players was convinced that Fable of the Mirror Breaker was a bad card, and we all know what happens. Well, that being said, I will obviously still try my very best with the knowledge that I have to give you the best 5 cards per color. And also, a heads up, English is not my native language, so if I mispronounce some of these cards, I am truly sorry. So let's get into it and have a look at what Standard cards you should look out for in Murders at Card of Manor. And I'll also make sure to leave timestamps to the different segments in this video in the description. Okay, let's start off with the color white. And once again, let me remind you that these 5 cards are not ranked in order. They are just the 5 cards from the color that I think will see the most play in Standard. And we're starting off strong because white seems like the most powerful color in the set. Now up first we have Case of the Gateway Express. Now this card is a case card, which is a new mechanic, and cases are quest-like enchantments with 3 abilities. The top ability is always active, the middle is the condition you need to meet to solve the case, and the bottom is the reward you get once you solve it. The described condition must be true as your end step begins. Now that the case is solved, the middle ability won't trigger again. Additionally, the last ability becomes active. If that ability is an activated ability, it can now be activated, and if it's a triggered ability, it can now trigger. If it's a static ability, that ability now functions. So Case of the Gateway Express is a 2-mana enchantment case. The first ability is, when this case enters the battlefield, choose target creature you don't control. Each creature you control deals 1 damage to that creature. To solve it, you have to have 3 or more creatures attack this turn, and once it's solved, the creatures you control get +1/+0. Now, I think this will be a solid card in white go white decks like Soldiers, White Weenies, or Boros Convoke. Like, just imagine this card combined with a card like Gleeful Demolition. I think it's very easy to solve, and the first ability will always remove something in the right deck. The last ability especially seems valuable in Go White aggro decks. It just does a whole lot of good things for 2 mana, and I love it. Now next up we have Dalny Streetwise Lookout. This is a 3 mana 2/2 legendary creature human scout that reads, creatures you control with power 2 or less can be blocked by creatures with power 3 or greater. And if an ability of a creature you control with power 2 or less triggers, that ability triggers an additional time. Now this kind of needs to be a build around, but it already has great synergy with a lot of creatures played in Standard. Think of cards like Brutal Cathar, Deep Cavern Bat, Breacher of the Schism, Resolute Reinforcements, Squee, Charming Scoundrel, and I could name at least 20 more creatures. The static effect is also a nice bonus. Alright, then we have Doorkeeper Thrall, a 2-mana 1/2 creature thrall with flash, flying, and artifacts and creatures entering the battlefield don't cost abilities to trigger. Now this card is a sweet sideboard card for white decks. I love the fact that it has flash, and stopping ETB effects is super valuable in the current Standard. Like, this thrall basically shuts down all creatures that Domain plays, it shuts down Discovers, it shuts down the Bat, and many more cards. And this makes it just the perfect sideboard card. Now up next we have Novice Inspector, which is basically Thraben Inspector, but with a different name. And this card is a 1-mana 1/2 human detective creature that when it enters the battlefield it investigates. And when you investigate, you create a clue token, which is a colorless artifact token, that when you pay 2 and sacrifice the artifact, you draw a card. Now this card easily slots into decks that care about having artifacts, has fantastic synergy with Gleeful Demolition, for instance, in Boros Convoke, and great synergy with cards like Warden of the Inner Sky. It's just a good 1-drop human, and just like Thraben Inspector, this card is going to be great. It's definitely a fantastic pickup for Boros Convoke in Standard. And the last card in my picks for 5 best white cards for Standard constructed is 10th District Hero. Now this is a 2-mana 2/3 creature human with 2 activated abilities. The first activated ability you have to pay 2 for and collect evidence 2. And then 10th District Hero becomes a human detective with base power and toughness 4/4 and gains vigilance. And then the second activated ability, which requires you to pay 3 mana and collect evidence 4, reads, if the anticipated hero is a detective, it becomes a legendary creature named Mileva the Stalwart. It has base power and toughness 5/5 and gains other creatures you control have indestructible. So this is just a powerful and versatile 2-drop creature. It's a great mana sink, and getting to the final activated ability seems crazy good as it will give your other creatures indestructible. Having a base power and toughness of 2/3 is also just great. I can see a lot of white creature decks wanting this creature, and especially the ones that care about having humans as well. Okay, it's time to move on to blue. Now, blue doesn't seem like it's going to be as impactful in the current meta as the white cards mentioned before, but there's still some good stuff in there. Now, first up in blue, we have Case of the Filch Falcon, which is a 1-mana enchantment case, and when it enters the battlefield, you investigate. In order to solve the case, you have to control 3 or more artifacts. And once it's solved, you can pay 3 mana to sacrifice the case and put 4 1/1 counters on target non-creature artifact. It becomes a 0/0 bird creature with flying in addition to its other types. First of all, I love the fact that this is a 1-mana permanent that puts another permanent on the board, and it's going to be a very nice pickup for artifact decks like blue-white artifacts or Simic artifacts. I like the fact that the solved ability animates one of your artifact tokens that's laying around and gives it flying and counters to that token, which also has amazing synergy with Zoetic Glyph, which artifact decks are already playing as well. Now, I'm quite a fan of this card, and for 1 mana it does a lot and will be a sweet pickup for artifact decks. Up next, we have Forensic Researcher, a 3-mana 1/3 merfolk detective creature with 2 activated abilities. For the first activated ability, you need to tap your Researcher, and when you do that, you can untap another target permanent you control. And the second ability, you need to also tap your Researcher, collect evidence 3, and then you can tap target creature you don't control. So, believe it or not, but this card has an infinite combo going for it in Standard, because 2 Forensic Researchers and a Deeproot Pilgrimage can create infinite tokens. You tap your Forensic Researcher to untap your other Forensic Researcher, and while you're tapping these merfolk, your Deeproot Pilgrimage will give you a merfolk token anytime you tap one of them. It reminds me quite a bit of this Curry Oak combo for those that are familiar, but perhaps you can give this haste or you can try and dodge board wipes. And this is where Valdalian Hexcatcher can come in clutch for merfolk. Now, this definitely needs to be a new build, but I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up seeing standard play in one way or another. Up next, we have Intrude on the Mind, a 5-mana instant that reads, reveal the top 5 cards of your library and separate them into 2 piles. An opponent chooses one of those piles. Put that pile into your hand and the other into your graveyard. Create a 0/0 colorless top tier artifact creature token with flying, and then put 1/1 counters on it for each card put into the graveyard this way. This seems like a card control players will love. It gives you a blocker at instant speed and reminds me a tiny bit of Shark Typhoon. You usually get at least 2 cards off this, mill 3 and create a 3/3 top tier. But you can also get a lot more creative with it, and in the heat of the moment, give your opponent the choice between you drawing 5 cards or creating a 5/5 flyer. It's just a really cool card. And then we have Cryptic Code, a 3-mana artifact equipment, and this card uses the Cloak mechanic. And the Cloak mechanic puts a card onto the battlefield face down as a colorless 2/2 creature with no name, no creature type, and ward 2. You can then turn the cloaked creature face up anytime you have priority if it's a creature card for its mana cost or disguise cost if that's relevant. So this card creates a 3/2 with ward 2 for you for 3 mana that cannot be blocked. You can then pay the mana cost to turn it face up at any point if it's a creature. Now, I like that this is an artifact too, and you can also return it to your hand, which can be a very powerful recursive threat in top deck situations. I also think it can be very powerful to cloak random creatures from your deck and catch your opponent off guard by turning them face up. Now, there's a lot of cards that could go in this last slot, but I ended up going with Proph's Eidetic Memory, which is a 2-mana legendary enchantment that reads, when Proph's Eidetic Memory enters the battlefield, draw a card. You have no maximum hand size. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you've drawn more than 1 card this turn, put X 1/1 counters on target creature you control, where X is the number of cards you've drawn this turn minus 1. So I like that this card immediately triggers when you play it, since you will have drawn more than 1 card this turn before combat. I can see 1 or 2 copies played at best, but it can be sweet for like a blue tempo deck to buff up your threats, or maybe even in the blue-white mentor deck. I think it can shine in a deck with few powerful threats and a lot of cantrip effects. Now, unfortunately, this does not work with Raffine because the drawing needs to happen before combat, and it can be likely that this is just an after rotation card, but it's sweet regardless. Alright, now it's time to move on to black. Now, this one was quite tricky to select the cards for, as there's definitely more than 5 cards that we'll see play. Black is one of my favorite colors in Magic, and I'm really excited about some of these. Now first up in black, we have Illicit Masquerade, a 4-mana enchantment with flash that when it enters the battlefield, you put an imposter counter on each creature you control. And whenever a creature you control with an imposter counter on it dies, exile it, then return up to one other target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Now this seems kind of insane in Reanimator decks. I see this in like a Golgari Reanimator deck with a lot of self-mill cards, or a Reckless midrange deck with Inti and Bloodlight Harvester for instance, that wants to discard a Tali, or even a Traxa if you're feeling ambitious. And then at instant speed, you can flash in an Illicit Masquerade in response to removal or blockers happening and get yourself a big Reanimator target from the graveyard. Or even use some sacrifice effects to do it yourself perhaps. This is a really cool card, and at 4 mana and with flash, it has to be good, right? Up next, we have Deadly Cover-Up, a 5-mana sorcery. And in order to understand this card, we need to look at the new keyword that's called Collecting Evidence. Now, collecting evidence is a cost that you may be asked to pay in a variety of contexts. Each time you're asked to collect evidence, exile any number of cards from your graveyard with total mana value of the indicated number or greater. Now, Deadly Cover-Up is a 5-mana sorcery that says as an additional cost to cast a spell, you may collect evidence 6. Destroy all creatures. If evidence was collected, exile a card from an opponent's graveyard. Then search its owner's graveyard, hand, and library for any number of cards with the name and exile them. That player shuffles, then draws a card for each card exiled from their hand this way. So this is a 5-mana unconditional board wipe, which is just neat, but this card gets really great if you can collect evidence 6. It's basically a board wipe and a Necromantia in one, and you can even hit a basic land with this if it's in the graveyard. But realistically, this card taking out a Sholdred or the Traxa is just great already. Perhaps this card can make a Dimir control deck or a mono black control deck pop up, but if anything, it'll be a sweet sideboard card in black decks. And up next, we have Long Goodbye, a 2-mana instant spell, and this spell can be countered. Destroy target creature or planeswalker with mana value 3 or less. Now this card is just a strictly better eliminate, which is awesome. And what I particularly like about this card is that it cannot be countered, which means that you don't have to pay the ward cost when you target a creature with ward, and that can be super relevant. For instance, look at Rafine. Now, there's a lot of 3-drops in standard, and I would be shocked if most black decks don't want to pick up a few copies of this fantastic removal spell. And up next, we have none other than Massacre Girl, Known Killer, a 4-mana 4/4 legendary creature human assassin with menace that reads creatures you control have wither. Whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, if its toughness was less than 1, draw a card. Now, Wither is a keyword that means that damage dealt to a creature by a source with Wither is dealt in the form of -1/-1 counters. Now, I think Massacre Girl is incredible and one of the best cards of the set. A 4-mana 4/4 with Menace is already great, but her ability is amazing. There's a lot of cards in Standard that work with ---- effects like Candy Grapple, Drown in Ichor, Virtue of Persistence, Black Sun's Twilight, and more that would all trigger Massacre Girl's draw ability. I think this could definitely make a mono-black deck that focuses on getting Massacre Girl value pop up, but I can see her played in many more black mid-range decks too. Now, if only Massacre Girl had a Meathook Massacre to play with, but maybe it's better that that's not a possibility in Standard. I still absolutely love this card though. And last but not least for black, we have Case of the Stashed Skeleton, a 2-mana enchantment case. That when it enters the battlefield, you create a 2/1 black skeleton creature token and suspect it. Now to solve the case, you have to control no suspected skeletons, and once it's solved, you can pay the activated cost of 1 in the black and sacrifice this case. Search your library for a card, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. Activate only as a sorcery. So this skeleton token makes a nice sacrifice target for bargain effects, and once you solve the case, you can pay the cost and activate the last ability whenever you need to tutor up a card for 2 mana. Seems very solid and does a lot for what it costs, and I can see Reckless decks or maybe even a mono black pick this up easily. Now let's move on to red, and red has definitely gotten some very powerful cards in Murders at Karlov Manor. Let me show you my top 5. First up in red, we have Case of the Crimson Pulse, a 3-mana enchantment case that when it enters the battlefield, you discard a card and then you draw 2 cards. To solve the case, you have to have no cards in your hand, and once the case is solved, at the beginning of your upkeep, you discard your hand and then you draw 2 cards. Now this card will be solid in aggressive red decks that can get rid of cards in their hand quickly so you can solve the case easily. Because once this case is solved, the card just seems nuts. It provides you with 2 cards next to the cards that you draw in your draw step as long as this enchantment is on the board. That means 3 cards drawn a turn. It's a great way for cheap red-based aggro decks to not run out of gas, and it works greatly with Inti as well, which is a nice bonus. And then we have one of the most hilarious arts on a Magic card that I've ever seen, Frantic Scapegoat. And this card has a new keyword, which is Suspect. A suspected creature has menace and can block for as long as it remains suspected. Now this is a 1-mana, 1/1 creature goat with haste that when it enters the battlefield, you suspect it. Whenever one or more creatures enter the battlefield under your control, if Frantic Scapegoat is suspected, you may suspect one of the other creatures. And if you do, Frantic Scapegoat is no longer suspected. Now, a 1-mana 1/1 with Menace and Haste is already solid, and giving a powerful 2-drop Menace for the rest of the game when you play the goat on turn 1 can be really helpful. I can see this card curve out nicely with Felden, for instance. You can also hold the card and give something like Adeline Menace in a Boros aggro deck. I'm not sure how this slots into red aggro at the moment, but once Commander rotates, I can easily see this take the card's spot. I can definitely see red mages experiment with this guy the second it comes out though. Next up, we have Fugitive Codebreaker. Now this card has the Disguise ability, and if a card has Disguise, you can cast it face down for 3 mana. It becomes a face down creature spell, which means it's colorless, it's a 2/2, it has no name or creature types, and it has ward 2. Anytime you have priority, you can turn a face down permanent you control face up by paying its Disguise cost. Now it's important to remember that turning a permanent face up does not cause it to re-enter the battlefield. Now, Fugitive Codebreaker is a 2-mana 2/1 Goblin Rogue creature with Prowess and Haste, and it has Disguise 6. This cost is reduced by 1 though for each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard. When Fugitive Codebreaker is turned face up, you discard your hand and then you draw 3 cards. Now, a 2-mana 2/1 with Prowess and Haste is already sweet for red aggro decks, and the current version of red aggro works with a good amount of instants and sorceries, which can be great for discounting the disguise cost as well on this little goblin. Now this card seems great on curve and also makes for a fantastic top deck thanks to its disguise ability. I can see red aggro experimenting with a full playset of this card. Up next, we have Pyrotechnic Performer, a 2-mana 3/2 creature Viashino Assassin that also has a disguise cost for 1 red. And when Pyrotechnic Performer or another creature you control is turned face up, that creature deals damage equal to its power to each opponent. So I like that this is a 2-mana 3/2, which are powerful stats for a 2-drop. And what I also like about this card is that it works great in multiples. If you flip a Performer face up with a Performer already on the board, it will deal 6 damage. Now I like that you can cast this creature on 2 if you need a 2-drop, and disguising it on turn 3 to create a 2/2 with War 2 isn't bad if it means you can flip the creature the next turn to deal 3 damage to your opponent for 1 mana. It might be a card that will see more play after rotation, but I think it's a card with a lot of potential already. And last but certainly not least for red, we have Krenko, Baron of Tin Street, a 3-mana 3/3 legendary creature goblin with haste, and an activated ability for which you have to tap Krenko and sacrifice an artifact. When you do that, put a 1/1 counter on each goblin you control. And whenever an artifact is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, you may pay a red. If you do, create a 1/1 red goblin creature token that gains haste until end of turn. Now a 3-mana 3/3 with haste is already nice, but Krenko does so much, there's no way it's not powerful enough to see standard play. There's a lot of goblins in standard right now that synergize with artifacts and sacrificing artifacts, but that deck kind of lacks a punch, and I think Krenko can provide that punch. Also, don't forget that Gleeful Demolition does put 3 goblin tokens on the battlefield, and we still have Goblin, Lord, or Runfeld Hordemaster in standard too. And last but not least, it's time to look at the best 5 green cards that Murders at Karlov Manor will bring to standard. First up, we have Aftermath Analyst. This is a 2-mana 1/3 elf detective creature that when it enters the battlefield, you mill 3 cards. It also has an activated ability for which you have to pay 4 mana and sacrifice Aftermath Analyst to return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Now this card is probably one of the best self-mill enabling creature cards we have in standard right now. A 1-mana 1/3 that mills 3 is just great, and the activated ability that brings back all land cards from your graveyard is a fantastic bonus. I can see this in Golgari or Sultai self-mill decks, and these decks are getting very nice upgrades in Murders at Karlov Manor. Now next up we have Axbane Ferox, a 4-mana 4/4 creature beast with Death Touch, Haste, and Ward, and the ward cost is Collect Evidence 4. Now, a 4-mana 4/4 with Death Touch, Haste, and Ward seems great for your average green-colored Stompy or aggressive decks. I think the ward cost is very interesting on this creature too, since you need to be able to collect 4 evidence to target this creature. I truly wonder if this card can make Mono Green Stompy return to standard, and I truly hope it will. Next up, we have Case of the Locked Hothouse, a 4-mana enchantment case, where the first ability reads you may play an additional land on each of your turns. In order to solve the case, you have to control 7 or more lands, and once the case is solved, you may look at the top cards of your library anytime, and you may play lands and cast creature and enchantment spells from the top of your library. Now, this card seems insane in domain decks, and once the case is solved, I think it will make whatever deck it's in unstoppable till the case gets removed. It will definitely see play in domain after rotation, but I wouldn't be surprised if domain players are going to experiment with this card the second it comes out. The solved case just allows domain to cast nearly every card in their deck. And then we have Sharp-Eyed Rookie, a 2-mana 2/2 creature human detective with vigilance, and whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, if its power is greater than Sharp-Eyed Rookie's power, or its toughness is greater than Sharp-Eyed Rookie's toughness, put a 1/1 counter on Sharp-Eyed Rookie and investigate. Now, a 2-mana 2/2 that keeps growing in the right deck and also gives you a clue token for your efforts seems solid. It also carries the human creature type for decks that care about that. Now, this card has that 1/1 counter synergy that could make it sweet with Botanical Brawler, and Evolving Adaptive is also still in the meta. A green-white Stompy deck with 1/1 counter synergy is so close to being good, and Sharp-Eyed Rookie can be the upgrade it needs, especially with the neutral Stani card coming out too, and I wouldn't be surprised if a Selesnya deck pops up because of this. This can also put in work to revive Mono Green Stompy in Standard. I really hope this card helps these archetypes become strong enough. It definitely does a lot for 2 mana. And last up for green, we have Rubble Belt Maverick, a 1-mana 1/1 human detective creature that when it enters the battlefield surveils 2. It also has an activated ability, which you have to exile Rubble Belt Maverick from your graveyard for and pay a green, and once you do that, you can put a 1/1 counter on target creature, activate only as a sorcery. Now this can be a sweet 1-drop in Golgari Graveyard or Descent decks. It's just a nice card, and Surveil 2 is better than Mill 2. It just does a lot for 1 mana, and I think it will do a good job at giving green Descent in graveyard decks the help it needs. Now, I won't lie to you, I was also very heavily considering putting Pick Your Poison in this slot, but I think Atraxa's Fall is more of a standard card, since for 1 mana extra you can choose what permanent to take out, rather than having your opponent sacrifice one. And green decks in standard are okay with paying 1 more for such a card, with less risk of it not hitting the card you need it to hit. Alright, so there are a lot of multicolored cards in the new set, and this means many good multicolored cards, so we're going to have a look at what I think will be the 10 best cards for standard in multicolor instead. And let's start multicolored off with a banger and praise the almighty Mole God, because first up is Enzrag the Quake Mole, a 4-mana 8/4 legendary creature Mole God, and whenever Enzrag becomes blocked, untap each creature you control. After this phase, there's an additional combat phase. You can also activate its ability for 7 mana, and if you do this, Enzrag must be blocked each combat this turn if able. So this card is kind of insane, especially when combined with a card that gives haste like Restless Stormseeker. The second you block this mole, you are screwed, because you give your opponent another combat phase while they also untap all their creatures, so they can just swing at you again with full force. It's almost always 8 damage to the face when it attacks, and demands removal the second it comes down. A super powerful pickup for Gruul aggro. Next up, we have Assassin's Trophy, a 2-mana instant that destroys a target permanent an opponent controls. Its controller may search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. Now this card is a reprint, but back when it was in standard, it was a fantastic removal spell for Golgari decks, and I think this will hold up. It's going to be especially punishing to be targeted by this spell if your deck plays little to no basic lands. And next we have Izoni, Center of the Web, a 6-mana 5/4 legendary creature elf detective with menace, and whenever Izoni, Center of the Web enters the battlefield or attacks, you may collect evidence 4. If you do, create 2 2/1 black and green spider creature tokens with menace and reach. There's also an activated ability that requires you to sacrifice 4 tokens, but when you do this, you surveil 2, draw 2 cards, and you gain 2 life. Now, I am very excited about this card. For 6 mana, it puts 9 power on the board with the help of the spider tokens with menace and reach. And that part of the card truly reminds me of Loth, who was a great planeswalker before the card rotated. I think especially when you can curve out playing a Blossom and Turtus on 4 into Izoni on 5, it's going to be super powerful. If any combination of colors can make use of collecting evidence, it will be Golgari. I think the activated ability can also be sweet with Sentinel of the Nameless City. I see this card as a few copies at the top end in Golgari midrange, and I think it's going to be putting in a lot of work in a deck, despite costing 6 mana. Next up, we have Lazav, Wearer of Faces, a 2-mana 2/3 legendary creature shapeshifter detective. And whenever Lazav attacks, you exile a target card from a graveyard, then investigate. Whenever you sacrifice a clue, you may have Lazav become a copy of a creature card exiled with it until end of turn. Now, a 2-mana 2/3 packed with Graveyard Hate that simultaneously generates clues for you is already amazing, But the fact that Lazaf turns into a copy of whatever creature you have exiled with it till end of turn when you sacrifice a clue is what makes the card nuts. It does so much for a 2-drop and will slot really nicely in the Esper mid-range or the Mirror mid-range. This card is super powerful. And then we have Lightning Helix, a 2-mana instant spell that deals 3 damage to any target and you gain 3 life. Now, Lightning Helix is another powerful reprint and will definitely see play in all Boros decks in Standard and make them a lot stronger when it's included. I wonder if this card could make a Boros burn deck pop up in Standard or maybe even some Jeskai control deck. And then we have No More Lies, a 2-mana instant that counters a target spell unless its controller pays 3. If that spell is countered this way, exile it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard. And all I can say about this card is thanks, I hate it. Up next, we have Breakout, a 2-mana sorcery that looks at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card from among them. If that card has mana value 2 or less, you may put it onto the battlefield and it gains haste until end of turn. If you didn't put the revealed card onto the battlefield this way, put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this card, looking at 6 cards, makes it dig pretty deep and gives it a high chance of finding whatever creature you want it to find for you. This card can put Picnic Ruiner on the board with haste, which seems crazy good for that deck. If you miss on hitting a 2-drop or lower, it's still not too bad to put a creature in your hand that you've selected out of 6 cards for 2 mana. But I think a lot of Gruul aggro decks, and especially the Picnic Ruiner deck, is going to be very happy with this card. Up next, we have Trostani 3 Whispers, a 3-mana 4/4 legendary creature dryad with 3 activated abilities. The first activated ability gives a target creature Death Touch until end of turn. The second activated ability gives a target creature Vigilance until end of turn. And the third activated ability gives a target creature Double Strike until end of turn. Now, as a 3-mana 4/4, this card is already great, and it has so many versatile activated abilities that it should feel like an auto-include in any creature-based Selesnya deck. I hope this card is going to be powerful enough to put Selesnya back in the meta. It can also be potentially sweet in an Absent Legends deck with cards like Thalia and the Gidrock Monster, and Valera the Living Cure. And then we have Tomik, Wielder of Law, a 3-mana 2/4 legendary creature, human advisor, with affinity for planeswalkers, flying, and vigilance. Whenever an opponent attacks with creatures, if 2 or more of those creatures are attacking you and or planeswalkers you control, that opponent loses 3 life and you draw a card. Now, a 3-mana 2/4 with flying and vigilance is pretty sweet, but then you have the incredible ability on there that makes you heavily benefit if your opponent attacks you with 2 or more creatures. Now, Standard is quite a creature-heavy format, and I feel Tomik will very easily make your opponent lose 3 life while you draw a card if not removed. Now, this card slots super easily into Esper midrange or Esper flyers, but I can also see it become important in a new Orzhov human deck with Delny. This card is just great for any creature deck that's in white and black. And last up, for multicolored, I have to talk about some nice multicolor pickups for my precious Simic Cookie deck, if you know you know. And first up, we have Kellen, Inquisitive Prodigy. Now, Kellen is a 4-mana 3/4 legendary creature, human fairy detective with flying and vigilance. And whenever Kellen attacks, destroy up to 1 target artifact. If you control that permanent, draw a card. There's also an adventure side on there, which allows you to investigate, and you can then also play an additional land this turn. Now, I like that the adventure side gives you an artifact and clue and ramps you up, but the best thing about Kellen is by far the creature side. The flying and vigilance on a 4-mana 3/4 is okay, but the fact that Kellen can turn your map or food tokens into card draw seems very sweet. Kellen can also remove your opponent's artifact if you need to get rid of it. For instance, a Subterranean Schooner or a Soul Cauldron can be good targets. I will definitely try a few copies of Kellen at the top end in my Simic Cookie deck. And last up, we have Repulsive Mutation. For X, a green and a blue, you have an instant spell that puts X 1/1 counters on target creature you control, then counter up to 1 target spell, unless its controller pays mana equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. Now, this is just a fantastic counter spell that can also buff up your creatures with 1/1 counters. It seems like it will do great in the Simic deck, and I think it's going to replace Disruption Protocol immediately when the card comes out. The counterspells in Murders at Carl of Manor are looking great. So now it's time to talk about the lands, and in this set we are getting the Surveil lands in all the guild colors. Let's have a look at Underground Mortuary, for example. So these Surveil lands all carry basic land types. This one has Swamp Forest. Underground Mortuary enters the battlefield tapped, and when it enters the battlefield you get the Surveil 1. So the obvious downside to these lands is that they come in play tapped, and this is a pretty great downside. What I do like about them is that they interact nicely with cards that care about basic land types. This is the case for the Domain ability, for instance. Now, I don't think these Surveil lands will see a lot of play till standard rotation happens and we lose the new Capenna Triumphs and the Crimson Vow and Midnight Hunt slow lands. it will then probably see play in a domain deck. But perhaps in the current standard meta, there are decks that care about triggering Descent, or just have really bad mana bases that might already want to play these Surveil lands. Now, another card that I want to mention is Scene of the Crime. This is an artifact land and clue. Scene of the Crime enters the battlefield tapped and can be tapped for colorless, and you can then also tap an untapped creature you control to add 1 mana of any color. The land can also be sacrificed if you pay 2 and then you draw a card. So this land can also pay for its own activated ability, which is neat. But I really like the fact that this is an artifact land, which can be relevant in artifact decks. Adding 1 mana of any color when you tap a creature can also be sweet in creature decks that don't have great land bases. And once again, I am not sure if this will see a lot of play before rotation, but I definitely like it the best out of all lands that we've gotten from Murders at Karlov Manor. Murders at Karlov Manor releases on MTG Arena February 6th, but you can already play with the new cards during pre-release events at your local game store February 2nd till 4th. Now, I really hope you enjoyed this mini set review for Murders at Karlov Manor, where I talk about the best cards from Murders in Standard. Also, if you enjoyed what you're seeing so far, don't forget to like and subscribe to the MTG Arena YouTube channel. And if you want to see more of my content, you can also check out some more videos of mine over on youtube.com/ashlizzle, or check me out 6 nights a week on twitch.tv/ashlizzle. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next one.